When you talk about the progress that you're making and the changes that you're seeing happen, does it worry you that this kind of progress will be held up or held into question as you look at this political cycle when we have candidates who are so outspoken or negative in terms of foreign policy, countries like China, when Donald Trump is so negative? Does it concern you in terms of the good progress you've made?
Well, I won't weigh in on politics. I've become diplomatic enough to stay very clear of that. But I will say that, certain aspects of foreign policy have to have continuity. There's no way to deal with the threats of our time, to deal with ISIL, to stop the financing, without actually building multilateral coalitions. And to build multilateral coalitions, you have to hear and listen what other countries' interests are. You have to be capable of building bridges, and I think President Obama has done a forceful job of that. We have a 65-country coalition against ISIL. We have a coalition to combat climate change. We've invested in UN peacekeeping, which goes to places that have not yet necessarily gone to full-fledged war, that implicates our direct national interest in the way that that's traditionally conceived. But if we nip things in the bud, that might mean fewer extremists in the long term. So you got to invest in the multilateral institutions and the multilateral framework. You can't just show up and get what you want when you want it.
Another subject we talk about every day on this program is Europe. There are a lot of headwinds that Europe's facing right now, and some of them are coming from the refugee, the migrant situation. And even overnight, there was talk about a possible deal with Turkey and the EU. You have been very involved in this issue. Where are we right now in terms of refugees coming out of Syria in particular, but the Middle East more generally, and what's the path forward?
Well, first to say this is a global phenomenon, a global tragedy. There are 60 million displaced people, 20 million of whom are refugees, meaning they cross an international border. The world has never been more generous. Private donors have never been more generous, governments, and yet the need is so outpacing the demand. One of the reasons we saw the spike in the flow to Europe was that the World Food Program, because of the size of the appeal and, again, the inability to fill it, despite the U.S. giving $5 billion to the Syria humanitarian appeals over the life of the war there, but by virtue of the fact that rations were being cut, schools were not being set up because there just was barely enough resources to feed people, never mind to take on the schooling. That's when people began to vote with their feet, and they got text messages saying your rations are going to be cut in half. If you're a parent, you're looking at your kids, you're thinking, okay, now make or break, let me entrust my family's life to this smuggler. That might be the best I can do. So it's either barrel bombs from the Assad regime, ISIL in this area, or a smuggler. It's talk about Sophie's choices. So I think what's important is that just as the phenomenon is a global phenomenon, so too the responsibility to deal with it has to be spread more equitably around the world. And President Obama actually in September at the General Assembly, when the heads of state come back together, is going to be chairing a head of state summit to try to actually spread the burden across more countries. There are many countries in the world who don't take refugees at all. They may be geographically far afield from Syria, but there's a way to actually spread the burden that right now is falling on the neighboring countries, first and foremost, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon principally, but now, of course, into Europe.
But to some extent, what you're talking about is the symptom. The refugees are the symptom of a fundamental underlying disease.
Yes.
Can we really solve this without radical regime change in Syria itself?
Well, what we can't solve it, in order to solve it, we have to have political solutions. And that's why Secretary Kerry is investing so much, including in collaboration with the Russian Federation, which has been on a very different side of this conflict for the better part of 5 years. But we are recognizing that one of the reasons the refugee flow is what it is that conflicts aren't ending as quickly as they once did. And so Syria is a good example. It's 5 years in counting. We've started to see a reduction in the violence by virtue of a cessation of hostilities. That's important. There's less refugee flow when there are fewer bombs falling from the sky. But a long-term solution is going to require something that's going to convince the majority of Syrians to put their guns down and convince Syrians abroad, when the time is right, to actually come home. And that's going to take a lot more work.
So realistically, how close are we to any sort of real resolution to stop this? I mean, there's meetings going on in Turkey right now saying, will there be a resolution? Is that even a possibility? As we head into warmer months, we're only going to see more refugees cross into countries like Greece and Italy.
Well, I think that's where David's point is so important. We've got to get a political solution, not just for Syria. We need out in Myanmar, there's the same issue of Rohingya getting on boats and risking their lives and entrusting smugglers and so forth. again, the rights within a country dictate whether or not people are willing to entrust the lives of their families to frankly, horrible, horrible people who are putting innocent families on dinghies that barely float and giving them life jackets that don't function. And so how close are we? I mean, it really depends on what we can achieve, again, on the political track in terms of whether the flow will continue. But I think it's also important to note that Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, there are financial investments we can make in these areas. The host communities that have sheltered these refugees for more than now going on 5 years have really borne this burden without it being spread around the world. And so part of what has to happen is we, the World Bank, others need to invest more again in those who've shouldered a disproportionate burden.
It strikes me that we have the situation in Libya where the world, the Western world, took a very different approach, a fairly militarily active approach, and the U.S. had a very significant role. And we end up with a result that wasn't very good. You've been a student of this for some years. What have we learned from the experiences of Syria versus Libya about what the best world response is?
Well, of course, we can't be satisfied with either outcome. The situation in Libya is very unstable, although they're moving haltingly toward a kind of government of national accord, which couldn't come a moment too soon because ISIL has laid down a foothold there. Look, in Libya, there was a great reluctance on the part of the Libyans who had earned themselves life without Gaddafi to want an international presence of any kind on the ground. Very proud, very attendant to their sovereignty, and basically said, thank you for the help getting rid of Gaddafi. We got it from here. And then there were divisions that tore the society apart. In Syria, it's very hard to argue, I think, when one looks back at the 5 years. No one can be proud of the results because of the heartbreak that happens every day because of the rise of terrorism. But by the same token, it's hard to see this magic tool that had we just done X or Y, suddenly, the demons that have been unleashed in Syria would have gone back into the box or into the bottle. So these are very complex societies. We open the toolbox that we have. We try to deploy as many tools as we can to mitigate suffering in order to get the kinds of political solutions that will bring the conflicts to an end sooner. But it's challenging, and we only have a short time left as the Obama administration. We're going to work every minute to try to put those conflicts in a much better place before we leave.
We're not going to talk politics, but as you watch all of this unfold, foreign policy is going to be extraordinarily important and difficult for the next president of the United States, maybe more difficult than any president we will see in our lifetime. What is the most important thing that needs to be employed those first 100 days? When you look at this, what do you think we need the most?
Well, I think an investment in diplomacy. There's a lot of talk in the certain circles in the campaign about military force, where would we use it, what would we do? But truly building these coalitions is what is required to bring about political solutions. And there's not one of the conflicts on the global stage that can be settled simply by the barrel of a gun. Even the terrorism challenge, where we've invested, of course, in combating that militarily and building this coalition, you got to cut off financing, you got to maintain border security, you got to share information about who's who in order to protect your people and make sure the wrong people don't come into your country.
Then are you surprised that diplomacy is, I feel like, what we've heard the least of in all of these debates and all of these meetings?
It's not. What is it? I don't know. I'm a diplomatic nerd, but it doesn't make much of a soundbite. It's not like the bumper sticker. Go do diplomacy. Go listen. That's not going to work necessarily in a campaign, but one hopes that cooler heads will prevail. And there are a lot of career foreign policy professionals who are also fuel our foreign policy across administrations, regardless of who's in place. So, again, we hope that investing in the kinds of coalitions that you need. Understanding that military force can be a component of dealing with violent people especially, but it has to be part of a fulsome strategy. I mean, that's something that, because you can't succeed otherwise, ultimately people are going to come to that conclusion.
Self-described diplomatic nerd. Right there. You said there's no sound bites around diplomacy. That's a bumper sticker, but we're not going to let you have it. This woman is some extraordinary guest. Ambassador Samantha Power, thank you so much for joining us today.